very bottom of my heart.
Tonight, on a special extended Reporting Scotland, the First Minister resigns, saying she knows in her head and her heart it's the right time to go. In a news conference earlier today, Nicola Sturgeon added it was getting harder to convince herself to carry on.
We must reach across the divide in Scottish politics. And my judgment now is that a new leader will be better able to do this.
She leaves after 8 years in the position, the first woman and the longest serving First Minister. We'll take a look back at her career in politics, from a 16-year-old activist to leader of the country. And what happens now? Who will be the next leader of the party, taking the SNP towards that de facto independence referendum?
And also in tonight's programme, we'll have the latest on the teachers' strike. The EIS union rejected the latest offer from councils, meaning strikes will go ahead next week. And we'll have a roundup of the day's sport as Scotland's women lose to Iceland at the Pinatar Cup. Hello, I'm Anne McAlpine in the Reporting Scotland studio.
And I'm Laura Miller, live from Holyrood. Welcome to Reporting Scotland. Good evening from Holyrood on what has become a seismic day in Scottish politics. Just after 11 o'clock this morning, Nicola Sturgeon addressed a hastily assembled media from her residence in Edinburgh to confirm that she was standing down as First Minister. It brings to an end an 8-year tenure, longer than any of her predecessors, and the first woman to hold that office. She said she knew in her head and her heart that it was the right time to go. Tonight, on the special hour-long edition of Reporting Scotland, we'll look back at Nicola Sturgeon's legacy and consider what the future holds for her party and the country. But first, it was our political editor, Glenn Campbell, who broke the story this morning, and this is his report on how the day's events unfolded.
No First Minister can go on forever, and today the longest-serving holder of the office called a short-notice news conference to announce she has had enough.
So today I am announcing my intention to step down as First Minister and leader of my party.
It was a surprise decision.
I know it might seem sudden, but I have been wrestling with it, albeit with oscillating levels of intensity for some weeks. Essentially, I've been trying to answer two questions. Is carrying on right for me? And more importantly, is me carrying on right for the country, for my party, and for the independence cause I have devoted my life to?
Her answer to both questions was clearly no. 16 years in government and at the centre of Scottish politics is an epic, grinding shift.
And the nature and form of modern political discourse means that there is a much greater intensity, dare I say it, brutality, to life as a politician than in years gone by. All in all, and actually for a long time without it being apparent, it takes its toll on you and on those around you.
She will continue as an MSP, but her personal mission to lead Scotland to independence is over.
And my judgment now is that a new leader will be better able to do this. Someone about whom the mind of almost everyone in the country is not already made up, for better or worse.
First Minister, if you can't lead Scotland to independence, who, if anyone, can?
I firmly believe that my successor, whoever he or she may be, will lead Scotland to independence.
She declined to name potential successors.
You know this is a huge moment in Scottish politics when you see the banks of cameras and the crowd gathered outside the First Minister's official residence, including those who are happy and those who are sad to see her go.
I wasn't expecting her to resign. It was a bit of a surprise for me, I think for quite a few people.
I must admit I'm overjoyed. There's too many unanswered questions now within the SNP.
I'm quite sad, but hopefully it's the best thing for her.
This brief wave to those outside serves as the First Minister's farewell, her departure a source of relief to political opponents. Just a few weeks after Rishi Sunak dined with her in Inverness, the Prime Minister posted on social media, "My thanks go to Nicola Sturgeon for her long-standing service. I wish her all the best for her next steps." The Scottish Conservative leader was more critical.
I believe that in her time as First Minister, we have become a far more divided country, and that's largely due to her efforts to separate Scotland from the rest of the United Kingdom, her focus being on another independence referendum rather than all the issues that should be at the top of the tree for any First Minister to deal with as a matter of urgency.
Other party leaders were more generous in their assessments, whatever their political differences with Nicola Sturgeon.
This is someone that has been on the front line in government for well over a decade, who led us through a pandemic in really difficult circumstances. And on a human level, I think that is worthy of respect, but also our thanks.
Dedicated, committed, tireless, but also empathetic. I think she's been a compassionate leader, and that's why she's been one of the most trusted figures in Scottish politics.
I think it's important to reflect on an extraordinary political career, Scotland's first female First Minister, and the First Minister that people will remember for taking us through COVID.
When Nicola Sturgeon left Bute House this afternoon, she was in casual gear, but she formally remains First Minister until her successor has been elected.
Well, Glenn is here with me now, as he will be throughout the programme. Glenn, quite a day. You're immersed, though, in the world of politics, day in, day out. How much of a surprise was this to you?
Oh, this was a big surprise. There is always speculation about the First Minister's future, some of it fuelled by her own musings about life after politics. I'd certainly become convinced that she wasn't going to serve a full term here at Holyrood, but I thought that the next UK general election might be the obvious point of departure. Only a few weeks ago, she said she wasn't going to do a Jacinda Ardern and resign like the Prime Minister of New Zealand. At that point, she said she had plenty left in the tank. Clearly, even then, she was starting to think otherwise, and she has surprised Scottish politics today by announcing her resignation. When Alex Salmond went, she was the obvious successor. This time around, I think it's far less obvious who will replace Nicola Sturgeon at what is the end of a political era.
Yeah, and we will get to that. You know, she made reference to it in her speech herself, but why do you think she's chosen now to step down?
Well, there are plenty of immediate pressures on the Scottish Government, a huge backlog in the NHS, there is a teachers' strike and the EIS union rejecting the latest offer, the ongoing row over the management of transgender prisoners. Within the SNP, there's a police investigation into the party's finances. Lots of reasons that she might want to give up now, but she insists that none of them were the cause of her decision today, that she's basically decided she can no longer give the job the 100% that she thinks it deserves. And of course, her ultimate goal, the one big prize that she has strived for throughout her political career, has been Scottish independence. And while she still argues that that can be achieved, she's concluded she is not the person who can bring it about. She is not the person that can break the deadlock over that issue, whether it's with a substitute referendum using an election as a test of opinion or some other means. She's going to leave that to others to decide and to pursue.
OK, Glenn, thank you for the moment, for your thoughts and insight. We will be coming back to you throughout the programme, as I said. Thanks for the moment. Well, Nicola Sturgeon has been a towering presence in Scottish politics for 2 decades, but she began her political journey at 16 as an SNP activist, then a campaigner, and eventually from MSP to leader and First Minister. Our political correspondent Andrew Kerr now looks back at a historic career in public life.
Nicola Sturgeon has dominated the political stage, not just in Scotland, but in the UK. A remarkable and long career at the top of Scottish politics has now come to an end. Nicola Sturgeon grew up with her family in Ayrshire, spurred into campaigning during the Thatcher era. She attempted to make the case for the SNP in a 1992 TV studio debate.
To make the point, first of all, that Ravenscraig and the other Scottish steel plants could be bought at a minimal cost to the Scottish people.
Garnering experience, passion and polish started to shine through.
What neither of these things can do is give Scotland a seat at the top tables of Europe, remove Trident from the Clyde, restore benefits to 16 and 17-year-olds. These are the things that the people of Scotland care about.
Friends and colleagues have been reflecting on that young ambition.
I started working with Nicola Sturgeon in the late 1980s, and then she was emerging as a very strong voice within our youth movement in the SNP. And what she's always been has been somebody who's contributed to, as a team player, to ensure the success of the SNP. It was never about her and her personal ambitions.
A law career ended and she became a lawmaker, elected to the new Scottish Parliament in 1999. With John Swinney bowing out as party leader in 2004, a formidable new partnership was born, Salmond and Sturgeon. The old party boss saw an opportunity for the SNP in 2007, and they won the Holyrood election, First Minister and Deputy. The partnership was successful. The people voted in a majority SNP administration in 2011. The road to the referendum was embarked upon. It was not to be though. Scotland said no in 2014 and Salmond exited the stage. It was Sturgeon's time, and there was that pop star style tour around the country. The next year, opponents were virtually wiped off the map in the 2015 Westminster election, a leader stepping up onto the UK stage.
My promise is this: if you vote SNP, we will make your voice heard. The SNP will always stand up for Scotland's best interests.
Brexit reignited the independence campaign. Nicola Sturgeon continued to fight the UK government, but another referendum has not been delivered.
I will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
A bitter internal battle also ensued with her predecessor Alex Salmond over sexual harassment complaints. But the pandemic then gripped the nation. Nicola Sturgeon's handling of the crisis boosted her popularity ratings.
I'll start with the usual report on today's COVID statistics.
But commentators have been pointing out perceived failings in education policy and the current state of the health service.
I mean, there's no doubt that some of the ambitions that she set out at the beginning of her premiership have not been fulfilled. Perhaps that's to do with public policy choices, but a lot of it will also be to do with the fact that there has been a global pandemic that swept aside all other issues.
Now the government seems mired in the row over the transgender issue, where the party struggles with independence next steps. But there will have been personal high points, a role in the world stage at the Glasgow Climate Summit, and a warm relationship with the late Queen.
A year's gap is incredible. Absolutely. So come and take a seat.
I think Nicola Sturgeon has been the outstanding politician of her generation, not just in Scotland, but in the United Kingdom. One of the interesting things for me is the extent to which, as the leader of what in global terms is essentially a regional government, she has gained such an international profile as First Minister of Scotland.
And supporters say she'll be remembered as a significant figure in modern Scottish politics.
As the first female incumbent First Minister, as the longest serving First Minister, as an electorally unchallenged successful SNP leader, I think Nicola Sturgeon has every right to look back on a record of political service which has been quite extraordinary for one individual to have accomplished.
It's been 8 long years at the helm for Nicola Sturgeon. Her talents will be much sought after elsewhere, as the party she loves now seeks a new leader. Andrew Kerr, reporting Scotland.
Well, I think it's fair to say the announcement this morning sent shockwaves through political circles here, but also at Westminster. And our political correspondent Rajdeep Sandhu is there for us tonight. Rajdeep, just round up reaction down there for us then.
Yes, Laura, despite this announcement happening during recess when most MPs aren't around Westminster, there was plenty of reaction. And just like in Holyrood, there was shock down here. Even senior SNP members in circles down here weren't aware that this announcement was coming at this particular time. Now, SNP MPs have been tweeting out their support and admiration, pictures of them with Nicola from times on the campaign trail. SNP MPs that I've been speaking to clearly quite sad about the announcement today, disappointment, some even frustrated, and felt that actually perhaps she didn't need to go just yet and kind of plunge them into this now leadership contest that will happen. Others were a bit more optimistic about the future who I spoke to today, perhaps because they didn't necessarily agree with the vision that Nicola Sturgeon had of how to get to independence. Now, there was also a reaction from opposition parties. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, thanked her for her long service and wished her well. There were similar sentiments from former Prime Minister Theresa May, who added that there was plenty that she could be doing from the back benches, given that Theresa May has stepped back and is on the back benches. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, said she'd served with dedication and passion. And of course, for the opposition parties, there is also opportunity here, because while there might be instability and uncertainty for the SNP's future, that could leave political advantage for opposition parties, especially now that such a dominant figure who was so good at winning elections is no longer going to be head of the SNP for much longer.
Yeah, and Rajdeep, Nicola Sturgeon has had her fair share of tussles with the UK government recently, but where does her stepping down leave the relationship between Holyrood and Westminster now?
Yes, well, this leadership election is going to be watched very keenly from down here, because the SNP won't just be electing a party leader, but also a First Minister and all of the responsibilities that come with that. And of course, that new First Minister will need to build a relationship with the UK Prime Minister. And of course, Nicola Sturgeon has had different varying successes of relationships with the different Prime Ministers that have come and gone in her time during office. Now, UK government ministers down here have been talking about resetting the relationship with a new First Minister, although privately one UK government source said that Nicola Sturgeon's record of failure had caught up with her and questioned her time in office and what she had achieved. Now, the Scottish Secretary Alistair Jack today described her as a formidable politician, but also urged the new First Minister, whoever that might be, to drop their divisive obsession with independence. Now, I don't think that is a strategy a new First Minister is likely to take on, but it does show what the UK government wants out of this. And of course, once that new First Minister is elected, they will have a large in tray of unfinished business. For instance, the arguments over gender recognition reform, something the UK government blocked, and that will be left in the in tray of the new First Minister. So there'll be lots and lots of questions on how that relationship will work between the government in Westminster and the government in Edinburgh.
Yes, indeed. OK, thank you very much, Rajdeep at Westminster. So now attention inevitably turns to what and who comes next. Nicola Sturgeon says she'll stay on until her successor has been found, but it leaves the SNP looking for a leader, the country looking for a First Minister. Well, our political correspondent Phil Sim is with me now. Phil, just in terms of the political machinery around this, what comes next?
Well, it's been almost 20 years since there's been a real SNP leadership contest, which really is an unprecedented run in British politics, but they're going to need to dust off the rule book now, because nominations for SNP leader are now open. We know from the SNP's constitution that candidates will need 100 nominations from at least 20 different branches, and if there is more than one candidate who breaches that threshold, then there will be an election of SNP members. It's one member, one vote. We're not quite sure how long that process will take. It has in the past taken months. I think there's an appetite to get that done a bit more quickly this time. The party's National Executive Committee will be meeting shortly to decide the rules of a leadership contest. But of course, that's all about the how of this. What's very important is the who is going to be the next leader. And I've been taking a look at the potential runners and riders for the biggest job in Scottish politics.
There's plenty in the tank.
That was Nicola Sturgeon last month. But politics moves fast nowadays, and within moments of her resignation, talk had already turned to who's next. she won't be drawn.
No matter how many inventive ways you find of asking it, I am not going to say who my preference will be to succeed me.
But who could it be? An obvious possibility is John Swinney. As the Deputy First Minister, he's seen as a safe pair of hands who knows the workings of the Scottish Government inside out. He's also been SNP leader before, although that might mean he isn't keen to do it again.
Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Another early favourite is the Finance Secretary Kate Forbes. She entered Parliament in 2016 but has had a meteoric rise through the ranks. Few would be surprised if she took the next step up, but she's currently on maternity leave following the birth of her first child, and it's not clear what her future plans are. Elsewhere, Angus Robertson has held leadership roles in the SNP before, having headed its Westminster group. He has a prominent position in Ms Sturgeon's cabinet as Constitution Secretary, and many believe he may see himself as a future First Minister. Humza Yousaf is another key cabinet member who may harbour ambitions for a promotion to the top job. He has held a number of senior jobs in government, but has been Health Secretary during a historically difficult moment for the NHS. Could there also be contenders at Westminster? The SNP's leader there, Stephen Flynn, has already ruled himself out. He says the party needs to be led from Holyrood. But it has been done before. Alex Salmond was SNP leader from Westminster, with Nicola Sturgeon acting as the Holyrood leader. The MP Joanna Cherry has been a critic of Ms Sturgeon's leadership, particularly on the issue of gender reform. So depending on the strength of feeling about that policy within the SNP, she might see herself as a realistic candidate. It's fair to say the party has not done much in the way of succession planning for life after Nicola Sturgeon. With a conference on its independence strategy due next month, whoever takes on the role will find themselves with a massive job at a pivotal moment.
Yes, indeed. Well, Phil is still here. Phil, you're immersed in this world, you know this world, but for people who don't, just explain, does being the leader of the SNP automatically make you First Minister?
Technically not. There would also need to be a vote here at Holyrood among MSPs to decide who the First Minister would be. And of course that is generally won by the leader of the largest party. That's always how it's been. And the SNP has not lost any ground in that regard, still very much the largest party at Holyrood. But as we mentioned there in the piece, it's not impossible for the SNP to choose a leader who's not an MSP. Alex Salmond was the leader when he was an MP and he had Nicola Sturgeon as his deputy here. But crucially, they were in opposition at that point. And I think from a practical perspective, if you had a deputy leader of the party who was here acting as First Minister, that's a lot of power for a deputy leader to have. So I think that is going to be something the party works through in the coming weeks. For now, a lot of the candidates today, potential candidates, have said they want today to be all about Nicola Sturgeon. This is her day where she's sort of on the way out. But it's the brutal nature of politics that she talked about in her speech today, is that thoughts are going to turn very quickly to who's next.
And we'll see if your predictions in your piece were correct. For the moment, thank you very much, Phil. Well, we have heard from the politicians and the journalists and correspondents, but today's news was a shock to everyone. And what do voters make then of the resignation? Our reporter Katrina Renton has been getting reaction from across the country.
This is Govan Hill in Nicola Sturgeon's Glasgow Southside constituency. We asked people here how they feel. Now she will no longer be First Minister, although she will remain as their MSP.
Despite being First Minister, she's been really present in our community the last couple of years, which is really impressive considering all the things that have been going on. I think it's a shock to us as much as everyone else.
Scotland has been polarised. You're either extreme for her or extreme against, and that's always been a bad thing.
I think she was good. I think she was a good leader. So I'm just not sure what's going to happen next, obviously. And obviously it was quite sudden as well. I didn't expect it to happen.
She's had her time being the First Minister, and maybe someone fresh just to come in and take the country forward.
Bye-bye, Nicola. Bye-bye, independence dream.
Dundee was dubbed Yes City. It was the council area with the highest support for independence at the 2014 referendum. The reaction there?
I think we've lost a good politician. One of the few politicians who could answer a question properly without deviating and without getting tripped up and getting back right on point.
I'm intrigued to see who'll be next and what they'll do for Scotland, I guess.
I'm sure she's had enough of everybody shouting at her and telling her how wrong she is. Yeah, she's probably just had enough. She's been there for a while now.
In West Hill in Aberdeenshire, it's the Conservatives who represent this constituency at both Holyrood and Westminster. So how do they feel about today's news?
I think it's fantastic she had the courage to go with her soul. However, I think whoever comes in has to get focused on the problems that the country has. drugs deaths, alcohol deaths, education attainment gap, and maybe just balance that with a bit of independence.
Bit of a disappointment, I think. She's been a very good leader for Scotland. I'm not an SNP party member or anything, but I think she's done very well.
She's wasted far too much energy on independence rather than concentrating on hospital, roads. Everything else takes a back seat.
This is Irvine, the Ayrshire town where Nicola Sturgeon grew up. So what do people here think of the local girl leaving the big job?
I am shocked, actually shocked. I seen it on the news this afternoon. I'm really shocked.
I'm sorry that she's going, but I'm not too surprised because she's been getting such a bad press over the past few months, which I don't think she deserves.
She's had, 8 years as First Minister, and probably now is the time to give somebody else the chance to maybe take the country in a different direction.
For me, she's done great, not just for the town, but for Scotland itself, you know, so.
Well, let's return to our political editor, Glenn Campbell, who is here with me. Glenn, let's talk a little bit about Nicola Sturgeon's legacy then, and let's come first to the question of independence. Do you think she will be credited as having moved the dial on the issue? Because in some ways, it might be argued we're more polarised than ever.
The country split down the middle on the question of independence, and the independence movement led by the SNP is completely stuck. The SNP and the Greens here at Holyrood think their majority is a mandate for another referendum. The Supreme Court of the UK has said they don't have the power to deliver a referendum without the agreement of the UK government, and that agreement is not coming anytime soon. So what to do to break the deadlock? Nicola Sturgeon thinks using the next UK general election as a substitute referendum could be the way forward. Others suggest using the next Holyrood election in the same way might be an option. One SNP MP has suggested they find a way of collapsing the administration here at Holyrood this year and turning that election into a referendum. They're having a special conference on the 19th of March to try and decide the way forward. I think there's a big question mark over that conference now, because that's likely to be in the middle of an election contest for a new leader. Are they really going to decide something as important as their independent strategy without knowing who is going to be in overall charge of the party?
And more broadly, you know, she said today that she wasn't stepping down because of the short-term pressures, the short-term issues, but there have been pressures recently specifically, haven't there?
Sure, I mean, there's been a huge row over the management of transgender prisoners, and that will come back here at Holyrood when a committee looks into it next week. Pressures that we've talked about in the public services, the NHS, and of course in education as well. I mean, I think Nicola Sturgeon will be remembered as the longest serving First Minister, the first female First Minister, the First Minister who said she wanted to close the attainment gap in education, and while she can point to some signs of improvement, that will be far from accomplished when she leaves office, even if her big expansion of free childcare, she hopes longer term, will contribute towards closing that gap. She will also, of course, be remembered as the First Minister who had a spectacular falling out with her predecessor, friend, mentor of many years, Alex Salmond, who now leads the rival Alba party. And this is what he had to say about news of her departure today.
I'm sure she'll be remembered as a politician who had great communication skills, fundamentally good. I mean, as was shown during the pandemic, when the messaging from Scotland was much clearer than it was from London. And secondly, she won elections, and which is what politicians are meant to do. So these are substantial attributes.
He's picking up.
Now that, I don't think, was the most generous tribute from Alex Salmond. Clearly there is a great unhealed rift between the two of them, and there's no immediate sign of that being resolved, if ever.
OK, Glenn, we're very grateful for your insight, but stay with us. We will come back to you later in the programme. And you can keep up to date with this story all across our websites. Go to the BBC Scotland News website for more analysis and reaction. on this story. But for the moment, that is it from Holyrood. We will be back later in the programme. For the moment, I'll hand you back to the studio and Alma Calpine for the rest of the day's news.
Thanks, Laura. Earlier today, the biggest teachers' union, the EIS, rejected a new pay offer. That means strikes will go ahead next week. The EIS described the new pay offer as inadequate and insufficient. That offer, which was made last night, was for an 11.5% rise spread over 2 years. The unions have been campaigning for a 10% rise backdated to last April and still haven't submitted a pay claim for this year. Well, our news correspondent Jamie McIver joins me now with the very latest on this. Jamie, a new pay offer was made last night, as we've been hearing, but that was fairly swiftly rejected.
Indeed, Anne, and disappointment, these are the words being used by both sides, though I suspect that is something of an understatement. The EIS had waited nearly 3 months for a new pay offer. The last one was made before their first strike back in November. So what's wrong with the new offer? Well, in a nutshell, the union thinks it isn't good enough. It falls well short of their aspirations, and the union argues it still represents a real terms pay cut with inflation so high at the moment. But councils and the Scottish Government, they're hugely disappointed too. They believe it was a fair offer worth £5,000 over 2 years for most teachers. So tonight, I'm afraid, it looks like deadlock.
Well, incredibly disappointed because the bottom line is that Scottish teachers have been waiting since April 2022 for a pay increase, and the offer that came forth last night did not represent really any hope that the dispute is going to be resolved imminently, because what was an offer was only a 1% improvement on the offer that's been rejected twice before and that teachers have now taken 3 days of strike action over.
We'll continue to discuss this with the unions. We want to see a resolution to this dispute. I don't want to see children and young people's education being disrupted anymore, and I'm very disappointed that while we continue those talks that the unions can't suspend strike action to allow children and young people to have that reassurance, particularly in the run-up to exams.
OK, Jamie, well, what does this mean now then?
Well, basically it means next week's strikes are on. Targeted strikes by the EIS next week in the constituencies of some senior MSPs, including the constituencies of Nicola Sturgeon and Shirley Ann Somerville. Then the next national strike, a 2-day strike, that takes place in a fortnight's time. Now, the gulf between the two sides, it's still a very wide gap. There are no signs of that gap really closing, and I don't see any possibility of a new pay offer being made in the next few days. Ultimately, were there to be any sort of improved offer, there'd need to be more money found to pay for it, either by the Scottish Government or by councils, and that could be a very difficult decision indeed, a lot of hard choices and where the money would come from. By the way, it's worth me pointing out that tonight the big union in some secondary schools, the SSTA and other of the major unions in Scottish education, it's to consult its members over whether or not to accept this offer, and their consultation will run until the end of next week.
OK, Jamie, many thanks indeed for the update there. The family of a mental health patient have claimed he died after experiencing brutal use of force by police and security staff at a Fife hospital. Joseph Sneddon was being treated in Victoria Hospital in Kirkcaldy when he died last April. His relatives say they've been told he was restrained for up to 3 hours by 6 police officers and 2 security guards. Our Home Affairs correspondent David Cowan has more.
7 years after the death of Sheku Bayou, another man has died after coming into contact with the police in Kirkcaldy. Joseph Sneddon was admitted to the town's Victoria Hospital last April, suffering from a mental health crisis. 48 hours later, he was dead. The post-mortem said he'd been restrained for 4 hours.
I want to ken how many nurses, how many doctors, how many police was there, why you be strapped to a bed. I mean, this day and age, if somebody's like that, you could give them something to calm them down. You didn't have to have them strapped down for 4 hours.
The father of 2 had suffered at least 34 injuries. A report on the case was sent by the Police Investigations and Review Commissioner to the Crown Office last October, but the family say they've been left in the dark.
He was physically fit. We're unsure of his mental state, but he walked into the hospital and then 48 hours later, he's dead. Nobody seems to give a monkeys what happened after this. And I think it was just the authorities thought it's going to go away. Well, I'm afraid it's not.
The family raised their concerns today in a 3-hour meeting with Scotland's top law officer, the Lord Advocate Dorothy Bain. They say she told them the Crown Office is trying to piece together exactly what's happened, which will in turn determine whether there was potential criminality.
It is clear that Joseph was a terrified young man who faced the brutal use of force. What the family do know now is that it wasn't hospital staff as such, it wasn't medical professionals, it was 6 police officers from Kirkcaldy and 2 security guards that were involved in the restraint of Joseph Snedden.
In statements, NHS Fife and Police Scotland expressed their sympathy to the family, but said they couldn't comment any further while an inquiry is underway. David Cowan reporting Scotland, Edinburgh.
A British man killed in Ukraine has been named by friends and family online as Jonathan Schenken from Glasgow. A family tribute on social media said the 45-year-old died as a hero in an act of bravery as a paramedic. The statement added that on enlisting in the armed forces of Ukraine, he made the ultimate sacrifice to defend values we all believe in. A rape suspect facing extradition to the United States has had a fresh request for bail denied over concerns he continues to be a significant flight risk. Nicola Rossi tried to convince Scottish courts last year into believing he was Arthur Knight, an Irish orphan who had never been to America. But after 11 months of court hearings, a sheriff ruled he was Rossi, a 36-year-old man that American authorities were seeking in connection with sexual assault charges. At a hearing at the Edinburgh Sheriff Court today, his bail application failed and he was remanded in custody. Let's take a break from news and politics then. Lewis is here with all your sport. Hello.
Yes, indeed. Hello there, Anne. Thank you very much. Let's start, shall we, with some international football in Spain, where Scotland got their Pinatar Cup campaign off to a losing start against Iceland. Scotland dominated the first half, but were made to pay for missed opportunities when Iceland took the lead just after the half-time break. Olaf Kristen Daughter's deflected effort getting the better of Lee Gibson in the Scotland goal. And the players had barely caught their breath when that lead was doubled. Kristen Daughter at it again with a brilliant finish just 50 seconds after her opener. It finished 2-0, and next up Scotland will face the Philippines on Saturday.
We had chances to score goals, and as you know in football, when you don't do that, then things can change. So I think at the beginning of the second half we have a couple of minutes of disconnection, and they scored 2 fantastic goals, and after that it's difficult just to come back from that situation. Still, I think the players, they put everything on the pitch. We have a few chances, but at the end I think the game was decided in those 5 minutes of disconnections, and not something that we are happy, but I think that's clear what happened in the game.
Back to the domestic game now, and there's one match in the Premiership tonight. St Mirren visit a Motherwell side who don't have their troubles to seek. The Fir Park club sacked their manager Stephen Hamill 4 days ago, and they haven't won a league game since October. Stuart Kettlewell has been placed in temporary charge as the hosts take on a St Mirren side led by their former manager Stephen Robinson. Before we came on air, I spoke to former Motherwell player Stephen Craigan about the club's current position.
Well, first and foremost, clearly on the pitch, the team have been underperforming. You know, the league table doesn't lie when you get to this stage of the season, so things clearly have to get better on that front. Off the field, of course, Alan Burrows is now moving on and is going to be chief executive up at Aberdeen, so everything just seems to be coming at once. But in football, if you get it right on the pitch, everything seems to be smooth.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're facing a St Mirren team tonight who do look smooth, like you say at the moment, a team fighting for a European place, and of course led by former Motherwell manager Stephen Robinson as well. Just how much is riding on this game for Motherwell tonight?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's simply just about finding a way to win, Lewis. That's what it's all about. I think too often this season, Motherwell have found a way to lose. Performance tonight is irrelevant. It's just simply about picking up 3 points. Stuart Kettlewell is going to be the man in the dugout tonight, so he's got a big job on his hands. The team have lost their last 4 games. The bigger picture is they've only won 2 out of 18, so clearly confidence is low, but that can change very quickly. If they get the first goal and they have a good performance tonight, it's amazing how quickly things can turn.
It certainly is, and it's a decline that not many people would have seen coming to a side like Motherwell, given they've not been relegated from the top flight in 38 years. Is there any hope that they can maintain that and turn this form around for survival?
Of course there is, you know, and people will look at the club and the position they're in and look at the squad of players and think, clearly they've underperformed, they've got a good batch of players. Sometimes it's just one result. They need something just to trigger off for them, something to go in their favour, and suddenly, as I said, confidence can come flooding back into them. So, I mean, there's still 14 games to go. You know, that's still a long way to go. Whoever the right man is, whether it's Stuart Kettlewell or it's someone else, there's certainly enough here to build on, to have a good platform and, you know, have a strong end of the season.
And finally from me, Scotland have secured top spot in the World Cricket League 2 with 3 games to spare by thrashing Namibia by 10 wickets. The Scots are in Nepal for their final games of the ODI competition and they bowled their opponents out for 153 runs. In reply, George Munsey and Kyle Coates are put on an unbeaten partnership of 157 in just 22 overs to cruise to victory. Scotland now play Nepal twice, either side of another match against Namibia before heading to a final World Cup qualifier in Zimbabwe this summer. And that's the sport for tonight.
Lovely, Lewis.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed.
Cheers.
Well, it's been a momentous day in Scottish politics, and if you're looking for more reaction to the news today, you can get that on Debate Night at 10:30 on BBC Scotland with Stephen Jardine.
On a huge day for Scottish politics, Debate Night is in Pitlochry, and our studio audience here will be asking the questions of politicians, a wannabe Prime Minister and a man who's cooked for every First Minister. That's Debate Night with me from Pitlochry, 10:30 on the BBC Scotland channel.
Well, before we go back to Laura at Holyrood, let's get an update on the weather forecast with Christopher. Hello.
Hi, Anne. Thanks very much indeed. Good evening to you. It was a bit of a wet start initially this morning, but then turning dry with some sunshine for many through the course of the afternoon. You can see that quite clearly on the radar. There's the rain earlier today clearing away, and then a number of showers across the Highlands and Islands. A few rumbles of thunder in the mix with those as well. So heavy downpours earlier across the Highlands with a few rainbows, a few rumbles of thunder. And now through the course of this evening, that showery band of rain working its way southwards through central and southern parts where it will be cloudy. But further north, where it's clear, it will be cold. Temperatures down to 1 degree in Inverness. Colder still in the countryside. Under the cloud further south, 6 or 7 is the overnight low. So to tomorrow, and it's a cloudy start for many central and southern parts, but brighter across the Northwest Highlands and indeed across parts of Lewis and Harris and the Northern Isles, albeit with a few showers. Through the course of the day, we'll start to see those brighter skies just working their way a little further south, so brightening up through the central lowlands and parts of the southwest through the day. Still mild with temperatures up to around 10 degrees, but the best of the sunshine, the best of the prolonged sunshine, likely further north and northwest. Notice, though, behind me, just starting to see some thickening clouds, sign of things to come. Across the Northern Isles at this stage, it's a brisk southwesterly with a number of showers. So, as we head into tomorrow evening and tomorrow night, cloudy, wet weather working its way in, strengthening winds too, because it will be a windy spell of weather overnight into Friday, all courtesy of this deep area of low pressure which is tracking its way eastwards, and a Met Office yellow warning which will bring some widespread gales, that low pressure system, and some disruption is likely. So first thing on Friday, rain in the south, that clears. Around the coast, severe gale force gusts, perhaps storm force gusts at times, certainly some disruption on the travel front. As we head through towards the afternoon, the earlier rain clears, but we're left with blustery showers and some sunshine, and temperatures a little bit fresher, looking around 7 to 9 Celsius by mid-afternoon, but certainly a windy start to the day on Friday. That's the forecast for now.
Well, I can tell you it is a cold evening here in Holyrood anyway. But welcome back to Holyrood on the most dramatic of days in Scottish politics. I'm very pleased to say I've been joined by two people who've witnessed their fair share of political drama. Kevin Pringle, former Communications Director for the SNP, and Andy McKeever, who held a similar position for the Scottish Conservatives. Welcome both. Kevin, was it the right time for Nicola Sturgeon to go?
She thought so. I think she can be quite satisfied that she's made this announcement today in her own timescale and on her own terms. There's no doubt it's a shock. If anybody says that they all knew this was going to happen, they're just kidding you, because this has shocked Scotland. It's actually been quite shocking across the UK, and I think, you know, huge interest elsewhere in Europe and further afield, because Nicola Sturgeon was a very senior figure. I mean, arguably the most senior, in terms of experience certainly, political leader anywhere in the UK. So a very, very major announcement today, a big shock.
But is there anger also?
No, I don't think. I think people are only really beginning to sort of process it now, actually, and think through what it all means has lots of different ramifications. But I think for me at the moment it's about recognising some of the important things that she said in her press conference today. I thought, for example, the most significant thing for me was when she talked about how she thought she'd become quite a polarising figure. Now, I think a lot of that is to do with the nature of the politics that we've had over the last number of years. A lot of very binary political issues, the independence question, Brexit across the UK, some of the policy issues, gender recognition reform, for example, that have been certainly debated, if that's the right word, in a very binary kind of fashion. So I think her departure says something about the binary nature of that, because inevitably, if you're involved, you're immersed in these issues, it does attach to you. So I think we have to sort of reflect on that and reflect on how we do our politics.
Yeah, let me just bring in Andy there. Andy, can you just sum up what Nicola Sturgeon, I guess, was like as a political opponent and as a political operator?
Well, Nicola Sturgeon was the biggest beast in UK politics. I think we should be clear about that. It wasn't just, as Kevin said, it's not just a Scottish issue, this, because if you look at what's happened over the last 5 or 6 years in particular, including through the pandemic, which I think put her onto a national spotlight and contrasted with Boris Johnson quite helpfully for Nicola Sturgeon, but she was the most significant figure really in UK politics. There isn't anybody else who was close to her. She had command of her brief, and it was very difficult for anybody to get anywhere near. And I think we need to remember as well, the SNP are so far ahead in the polls at this point too, that it was very easy for her to have that sort of command. So I think from that point of view, it's very significant. As an opponent, she was very difficult because she was very difficult to trip up. She had complete command, as I say. Nobody really could get on top of her in a sense. And it's only been in the last 4 or 5 months that issues have just started to pile up a little bit. I mean, she said today, and I think that that's absolutely correct, that there wasn't a single thing that made her do this. But there's no doubt that if you compare the last 6 months to, say, a random period 5 or 6 years ago, the number of issues have just started to pile up. You know, gender recognition obviously is one of them. But the independence strategy, the proxy referendum strategy, was quite controversial internally. That started to cause problems, and other policy issues have started to pile up as well. So it's been very different for her over the last 6 months or so. And it's the first time really that I can remember that opponents have started to see a little bit of a chink in the armour that they can actually start to exploit.
Well, let's pick up on some of that with Kevin. What does it mean then for the party now, and more specifically the cause that Nicola Sturgeon has spent her whole political life campaigning for, independence?
I think what is important now is that there is a proper, open, contested leadership election, because I think the SNP have got an awful lot of things to discuss. There hasn't actually been a contested leadership election now for nearly 20 years. It was 2004, the last one. So I think the SNP needs to take time. I think it has the time. It was rushing towards a March special conference to decide its position in terms of the next UK general election, as Andy said, about a potential de facto referendum platform. But that had been decided, I think, before Rishi Sunak had become Prime Minister, when it was thought, well, you know, there could be a UK general election any time soon, any time, you know, 3 weeks come any Thursday. That's not the case. There's not going to be that election unless something extraordinary happens until next year. So I think the most important thing for the SNP now is to take the time, which Nicola Sturgeon has actually given the party, because the de facto referendum approach is very much her idea, as a part of, if we remember, the process of referring the issue of an independence referendum and where powers lie to the Supreme Court.
Because they've got to get that right as well. I mean, I think it's really important for the SNP. You can't get this decision wrong, because the next test of public opinion on the independence question is probably the last test of public opinion on it, whether it's a yes or a no. So I think that's why there was so much worry about the strategy of a proxy referendum, because you can't get it wrong. And the difficulty with that is that if it had gone to that in the 2024 general election and the SNP had not got that 50% of the vote, the unionist parties would just have turned around and said, well, you've had your Indy Ref 2 now, so it's over anyway. So it's something the party can't actually afford to get wrong.
Do you think they will now scrap that?
I do. Yes, I think they will. It may not be scrapped forever, it might resurrect itself in some other form, but I expect that there'll be a pause now where a variety of candidates can think to themselves, how do I actually navigate this? The Supreme Court decision has given the SNP a real difficulty because they have to create something that's not just vote SNP for Indy Ref 2. That's the strategy for the last 5 or 6 elections, but it's dead now, so you have to have something in its place. And I think there's been too much internal discord about whether that should be, what that should be. So they've got time. They're not under any pressure from anybody. So they've actually got time to sit for a few months and think, what's the best way to navigate through this? Because we have to get it right.
Kevin, where do you think this leaves the relationship between Holyrood and Westminster now? Because over the last recent times, there have been particular tussles, shall we say. Where do you think things now stand? Is it a position of weakness that there isn't a First Minister who will now be continuing?
I don't think so necessarily. I think a lot will hinge on how the SNP goes about choosing its next leader and who will then become First Minister. I think a good, healthy democratic debate will stand the SNP in very good stead. So I don't really see that's a difficulty. I think maybe to pick up on a point that Andy made, I think there's been, for me, I think too much focus on process, too much focus on what particular route or mechanism could unlock the way to independence. I think something that the next leader might want to think about, no doubt that Nicola Sturgeon's thought about it an awful lot as well though, is the priority being to build support for independence so it's in a majority position. So I think if that's the case, then in a sense the issue of precise route or mechanism becomes a secondary one, and then you've got a variety of choices. You can use to how you exercise that independence majority, whether it's through for example a de facto referendum for Westminster, for Holyrood, whatever. But until you have that majority, you don't actually have that choice to make. So I think a lot of this will go to debating at the grassroots of the party across the wider Yes movement about how do we build that majority and ensure it's sustained in a similar kind of way that there was a very sustained majority for a Scottish Parliament that was built through the 1980s and 90s, and then it just could be a question of when.
And those are questions that we'll have to wait for another time, but we've run out of time with you gentlemen. But thank you very much for joining me in a rather cold Holyrood. Thank you very much. Well, events started to become clear mid-morning, and by the time Nicola Sturgeon's resignation came at around 11 o'clock, it was more a matter of confirmation. We've heard some snippets of what the First Minister had to say earlier on in the programme, but here's more of what she said.
I've been First Minister for over 8 years. Giving absolutely everything of yourself to this job is the only way to do it. The country deserves nothing less. But in truth, that can only be done by anyone for so long. For me, it is now in danger of becoming too long. A First Minister is never off duty, particularly in this day and age. There is virtually no privacy. Even ordinary stuff that most people take for granted, like going for a coffee with friends or for a walk on your own, becomes very difficult. Leading this country through the COVID pandemic is by far the toughest thing I've done. It may well be the toughest thing I ever do. I certainly hope so. Now, by no stretch of the imagination was my job the hardest in the country during that time. But the weight of responsibility was immense. And it's only very recently, I think, that I've started to comprehend, let alone process, the physical and mental impact of it on me. Winning independence is the cause I have dedicated a lifetime to. It is a cause I believe in with every fibre of my being. And it is a cause I am convinced is being won. I intend to be there as it is won every step of the way. Few people understand the price families of politicians pay for the jobs we choose to do. Mine have been my rock throughout. To all of the people of Scotland, whether you voted for me or not, please know that being your First Minister has been the privilege of my life. Nothing, absolutely nothing I do in future will ever come anywhere close. Thank you from the very bottom of my heart.
Well, our political editor is back, and also our political correspondent, Lindsay Bewes. Lindsay, you were in the room when the First Minister was making that speech. Just sum up the mood and the atmosphere.
Yeah, well, this announcement today, of course, caught everyone by surprise. So you had journalists scrambling to get to Bute House for this press conference today, having been given less than 2 hours' notice it would be taking place. There was a sense of palpable anticipation, waiting for Nicola Sturgeon to come to the lectern. By that point, we knew she was resigning. What everyone was waiting for was the reason she would give as to why she had taken that decision. A couple of things that struck me: the reflective tone that Nicola Sturgeon took in her speech. It was clear she'd been thinking about this for quite some time. She mentioned the personal toll that life at the top of politics can take. She's reflected on that before, but I thought she was particularly open about that today, and also the acknowledgement that she can be a polarising figure in politics. At times, I thought she sounded emotional, particularly at the end when she said this was the privilege of her life to do this job. And there was emotion elsewhere as well. A member of staff told me they'd been called into a meeting yesterday. It had been an emotional meeting to hear this news. MSPs hearing earlier on this morning in an email there had been some tears shed as well. So a very significant moment, not just for Nicola Sturgeon, but for her party and all her staff too.
And just briefly, you've been at a million, you guys have been at a million of these things. What was different today?
Well, yeah, Bute House has been the venue for some pretty dramatic moments. The resignation of Alex Salmond following the 2014 referendum. Nicola Sturgeon's own announcement she'd pursue a second referendum after the Brexit vote in 2016. But those came after dramatic events in politics. This announcement came on a day in February recess from Parliament when no one expected it. But the impact it's going to have is going to be huge, not just on the SNP, not just on the Scottish Government, but the entire Scottish political landscape, Laura.
Glenn, I imagine you'd echo all of that, but perhaps just you could give us your final thoughts on what is a momentous day for Scottish politics.
Yeah, just one small aside. Nicola Sturgeon lost a bet today because the Conservative leader Douglas Ross bet that she wouldn't stay on until the next Holyrood election, and apparently she offered double or quits on her outlasting him in a leadership role. Well, that means she owes him £100. She said he could have the bet, but her party, the SNP, would keep winning elections in Scotland. Well, will they? It won't be under her leadership, which has been very successful when it comes to winning elections. Is there somebody who can now step forward and take over from one of the towering figures in Scottish politics who's now stepping back and stepping down?
Lots of questions, I'm sure, but we'll try to answer them in the coming days and weeks and who knows, months perhaps. OK, thank you very much both. That is Reporting Scotland on a quite momentous day. Scotland's longest serving and first female First Minister has decided to call it a day. She said she knew in her head and her heart it was time to go. Wasn't clear before, if it is now. We are at a crucial juncture in Scottish politics. From Holyrood, good night.